In this episode, we'll be joined by Rod Kight, an award-winning lawyer, advocate, and author who leads his own cannabis practice in North Carolina. We're going to be discussing the hysteria that has been caused by hemp and the recent letter that was signed by a coalition of 20 state attorney generals addressed to Congress. This is the Cole Memo. I'm your host, Cole Preston. Every episode is released in audio, video, and transcript format. To find the transcript, audio, or video version of any episode, please refer to the description of the episode that you're listening to now. Within that description, you can find a link that will take you to our website, which will display the transcript for this episode and the platforms where you can find this episode in audio or video formats. If you're unable to locate the episode description on whichever platform you're listening from, simply note the episode number and visit thecolememo.com. From there, you can use our search functionality to find the corresponding episode, and then you'll be able to access the audio, video, and transcript version of that episode. You might also find any links that we reference during the episode so that you might be able to do your own research. If you're not listening to this episode of the Cole Memo on Patreon, then you're listening to this episode later than our patrons. To become a patron, go to thecolememo.com/Patreon. It only costs $3 a month, and you get immediate access to the episodes of this podcast as they release. It's a great way to support our show. Our show is brought to you by listeners like you. If you're not able to make a monthly contribution of $3 a month on Patreon, maybe you could make a one-time month contribution of $1 at thecolememo.com/support. You can make a contribution of your choice, one time, monthly, or yearly at thecolememo.com/support. Once again, our show is brought to you by listeners like you. It costs a lot to do our show between hosting fees, distribution, travel, equipment, and so much more. All of your support is appreciated. One of the best ways to support our show is absolutely free. Subscribe to or follow our show. Leave a positive review from wherever you're listening to us from. Favorite this episode, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, or post a review. Your engagement and support is appreciated. Today is March 28th, 2024. Enjoy this episode of The Cole Memo featuring Rod Kight. Rod, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. Go ahead and introduce yourself to my audience, please.
Hey, Cole, great to be here. Thanks for having me. So, my name is Rod Kight, and I'm a lawyer. I represent businesses in the cannabis industry throughout the United States and the world. And I'm happy to be here to talk about all things cannabis. And we're probably going to focus a lot on hemp today, but wherever it goes, it goes.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who may not know or be aware of your work, tell us where we can find you online.
Yeah, sure. So, probably the main place is my website, cannabusiness.law. And I have a blog, Kight On Cannabis, KIGHT on cannabis.com. But if you go to the website, my law firm website, the blog is actually one of the buttons that you can click. So yeah, come see me there.
Perfect. And folks, if it makes it easier on you, we'll have links to that in the podcast description. So check that out. Yeah, I have been familiar with your work for a good while, I would say now, a little bit over a year. Some of my friends and we read a lot about hemp, and your name pops up a lot. And actually, I think the first time I heard about you was when I spoke to the Illinois Hemp Growers Association. They said, "Oh, you got to read this Rod Kight. He's great." So I think that's when I first heard about you. And I recently saw your name pop back up with your latest article. I figure this is a good place. Maybe we can dive in. Uh,
Sure. Absolutely.
maybe we could give people a little bit of a background if they've been living under a rock, but then maybe we can dive right in here. So Rod, take it away. The state AGs, they're
Yeah,
kicking up the war on
sure.
hemp again, right?
They are. A lot of folks are. I write these blog articles and I try to focus on, giving some legal and practical information to people about contemporary issues that pop up. And so this issue is one that came up where a whole group, not quite half the country, but I think it was 20 off the top of my head, state attorneys general signed a letter to Congress, and they essentially engaged in what amounts to old school reefer madness, decrying what they consider to be this unregulated loophole of intoxicating hemp cannabinoids and wanting to shut it down. And unfortunately, AGs, as we call them, attorneys general, have by and large not been very helpful towards the hemp industry. And this is just the latest. And it just happens to be at a really critical time right now because we're looking at a new farm bill. Farm bills are, at least the last two, have been historically where hemp has been legalized and defined. And so we're looking at that sometime in the next 12 months. Additionally, we've got a lot of legislation that's being proposed in various states. Most of it at this point is very anti-hemp. And in addition to the state AGs, we've had other different groups that are also sending letters. And so it feels in a lot of ways like there's a bit of a war on hemp. And so my article was just, to notify people that yet here's another attack on hemp, and it behooves us all to get politically active about this. And second, to carve out a path for how I see hemp reform taking shape over the next several years, and ultimately, cannabis reform generally. And by that I mean the whole thing. Hemp, marijuana, the whole kit and caboodle, so to speak. So that's what the article is about. And I'm glad that you read it, and I've gotten some pretty good feedback about it. Fortunately, we'll see if that changes anything in terms of what the AGs are going to do or not do. But at least it provided a platform, I think, to try to get some of this information out.
Yeah. And I want to take a step back maybe for just a moment. I've been thinking about this lately, and Rod, I don't know if you know the answer to this, so I'm just going off the top of my head here. In the past, and maybe I'll pull up a picture for this, I think people, when they had hemp in their mind, they think of that long, like that tall plant
Mhm.
that you don't smoke, and we've almost like colloquially like accepted that that is what hemp is. But it wasn't until 2018 that we actually had a legal definition for what hemp is. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it seems like, as you mentioned in your article, and it seems like it always comes up in the debate, this was not the intent of the farm bill
Mhm.
to legalize intoxicating cannabinoids. And they always say, well, you can do the fiber, you can do all that, but the intoxicating, that was never the intention. And I just like wonder if, look, I know there's nuance, and I'd love to get into like what is the definition of intoxicating, intoxication and stuff, right? But really, when it comes down to it, I guess the point I'm trying to make is sometimes people describe hemp as cannabis's cousin. And just speaking
Mhm.
to scientists, it's like, no, it is in the same exact genus and species as cannabis. There's really little to no difference um in the plant itself. It is not a
Mhm.
different plant, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you brought this up because this really gets to the fundamentals. I mean, there is, from a botanical standpoint, there's no such thing as hemp. There's no such
Right.
thing as marijuana. It's all just cannabis.
Right.
And we have a legal distinction. And, you know, what I think we have a lot of resistance to is this idea of what hemp is, or really what hemp should be. And it gets to that point about, oh, no, 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 hemp is fiber, it's grain, it's industrial uses, and so on and so forth. It's not about consumable products, and particularly not consumable products that are intoxicating. And that's just wrong, and it's based on a misconception of what hemp is. And I can track, this legally. This is not just me talking. So, the cannabis itself was first removed from the controlled substances list and legalized in the form of industrial hemp with the 2014 Farm Bill. And so It was pretty monumental. Congress in that farm bill said, "Well, we're gonna carve out an exception to the illegal status of marijuana for something we're going to call industrial hemp," and it was a pretty basic, plain Jane definition, and it also was pretty restrictive. It really was up to the states, and they, had to have this special kind of program. I won't go into the details about that now, but that sort of ushered in the beginnings of what we see as the hemp, sector, the hemp industry, the hemp movement. But what I think is really important is we got to 2018, and a lot of people trace that back to the beginning of this, but it was actually 2014. But what was important in 2018 is that the definition of hemp was changed pretty dramatically. First of all, they dropped industrial from the definition, from the word. They renamed it hemp. And secondly, they went in and they didn't just say the cannabis with all of its parts. They say cannabis in all its parts, including its cannabinoids, extracts, derivatives, isomers, salts of isomers. I mean, it went into a lot of detail on a chemical level about what that means. And so it's absolutely and completely clear that this whole industrial use thing with, just being about tall, stocky plants with fiber and seeds is just completely wrong. Now just to be totally clear, the fiber seeds, all these other uses for hemp are phenomenal. And I truly think the cannabis plant, I'm one of those true believers that thinks it can really solve a lot of problems. But today and right now in this moment in time, we're really talking about cannabis and the intoxicating properties, so to speak, and the ingestion and use of cannabinoids, from hemp. So that's where our focus is going to be today. But anyway, it's called a loophole. People say this was not the intent, whatever, and they're all just well, they're all just wrong. Just to get
Yeah.
right to the point about that. There's no evidence to support anything. It's just this idea of what hemp is or what it should be, not actually what it is legally defined as.
Yeah. And I'm trying to think of other examples where it's like, okay, I feel like to say that they didn't intend them, let's start here. I feel like to say that they did not intend this absolves them of what the actual process actually involves. It's not, I always make the joke, it's not like Mitch McConnell wrote the Farm Bill by candlelight, on his farm. It was
Right.
written by other people. And I just wonder, I've always made the joke, like, I wonder if before everybody signed it and sent it to, President Trump, if they were like, this is about to happen. Everybody shut up. Like, we're going to
Yeah.
get this through.
I think there were some people like that. I mean, this whole intent thing, I've actually got a few responses to that because this is always brought them, thrown up. Oh, it's not the intent. Well, we have no evidence about the intent or lack of intent. First of all, it's just not there. I'm pretty confident that Mitch McConnell did not intend to legalize,
Sure.
THCA flower and D9 beverages and all that. Whatever. But he's one guy.
Right.
There are plenty of people that are cannabis friendly in Congress that can't get any kind of positive movement on anything, the banking or that kind of stuff. And so I think a lot of them probably thought that very thing. Ooh, this is really a good chance. Let's let this go. So I think that happened. And then, just as a matter of legal interpretation, what you learn as a first year law student when you're reading a statute is that if the terminology, the wording of the statute is clear, then the intent of the lawmaking body, in this case Congress, is totally irrelevant. You just have to assume that if it was clear that that's what they intended. The only time this intent thing even comes up is if there's some ambiguity in the statute itself, and that's not there. I mean, the statute is super clear about what it says. So this whole intent thing is just a big fat red herring. It's just people that are either prohibitionists about cannabis, or they don't understand the opportunity we have here, or they have some other financial incentive to try to put down, hemp.
Yeah. And I know that you may not have much to add to this point because you're not from Illinois, but one could argue that the intent of our cannabis law in Illinois was to end arrests altogether, but they continue in the state of Illinois for oftentimes like simple things like just possession of
Mhm.
cannabis. So that's kind of where I can think of like the other side of the argument. It's like, sometimes people have an intent with law and it falls short of that. You know what I mean? So it's like,
Yeah, that's the double-edged sword. That's
right.
exactly right. A lawmaking body creates a law. Maybe the people who wanted it to be a certain thing, it gets interpreted a different way than they anticipated. Or, there's the old, sort of statement, or the idea, if you like sausage, don't, or laws, don't watch them get made. What ultimately happens is someone puts out a bill, and if it's anything with any substance, all sorts of different groups are in there tweaking it, and so what you come out with sometimes is a bit of a Frankenstein. Or at least it might not have the intended effect. But again, when it's clear, and that's the deal.
Yeah. Did you have other thought? You said you kind of had a few thoughts there with intent, and I know I jumped in with that. Did you have other thoughts you wanted to add? Just
No, no, thanks. I just, this. I think I just wanted to cover the fact that the statutory reading, the fact that there are plenty of people in Congress that probably thought this was a good thing, and maybe just this idea that it's not like the 2018 Farm Bill definition of hemp just popped up out of nowhere. We had a 2014 Farm Bill. And it was expanded upon in the wake of
right.
cannabinoids being made available and consumed by the public. So it's, again, everything points to the fact that the intent, if there was an intent that we can point to, it was to do exactly what's happening right now, which is to have all of these hemp products, the deltas, and so on and so forth, including CBD and all these other things that we see on the market.
Yeah, I was never aware of this. I had a loose awareness of the Farm Bill being introduced in 2014. I think because Illinois observes USDA rules on this. So I've heard and I've seen references to the 2014 Farm Bill, but I never really understood the difference or what had changed between 2014 and 2018. And now knowing that, I agree. That really strengthens the argument against the idea that this was not the intent. Again, I just want to say, because I know there's maybe like a cannabis industry lawyer right now watching that is thinking Mitch McConnell, like you just said, Mitch McConnell did not intend for people to, yeah, sure, right? But again, it's not like Mitch McConnell or many of the other people that like sponsored the bill that were lead
Mhm.
sponsors wrote any of the words in the bill. That's
Mhm.
not really how legislation works, as I understand. Unfortunately, I mean these
Yeah,
people don't write their own bills; other people write them for them. So
that's exactly right. Exactly right.
very interesting. Look, the part that I particularly found interesting, if I didn't make it obvious enough, was the dropping of the industrial, because I
Mhm.
always hear that as the argument. This was just industrial. It was never meant to be consumables. That's what they always say.
Yeah. So why do they drop the industrial from the term? That's
Right.
exactly right.
Yeah. And I'm just kind of get to brass tacks here. I'd love to maybe talk about the nuances of intoxication, but I'm just curious,
Mhm.
why are we not seeing an open embrace of this? This is the answer, it seems.
I think it's the answer, and I think it's a few things. So I think first of all, it's going to be difficult. We have a century almost of a lot of propaganda about cannabis, and for a lot of different reasons. But it's just there's reefer madness. It's been our culture has been inundated with it, and it's just I think it's difficult to shake off, unfortunately. There are always going to be people that think that intoxication is bad, or at least certain forms of it are bad, and certain people that just think that cannabis is sort of the devil's weed. So I think that's part of it. We'll always have this sort of segment. I think another piece of it is, the fact that what I talked about earlier, people have an idea in their mind about the way something is or should be. And for a really long time, we've had this idea, of hemp being something over here, this
Right.
industrial piece, but also with respect to the legalization of marijuana, the liberalization of cannabis, we've thought, oh, what's going to happen is we're going to have state after state after state go through a medical thing and then a rec thing, and then we're going to reach this point in time where the dominoes are going to fall. We're going to deschedule it, and that's that. And that may end up being the way it goes, but certainly progress has been really slow. Again, we can't even get a decent banking bill through Congress. We're trying to get marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, and apparently the DEA is holding things up, and it's this big to do, just that little incremental piece. And so, but I think that that's the way people see it. And what they don't see is that hemp itself has legalized cannabis in an enormous way and normalized it. And that this is sort of, I used to call it the backdoor way, but it's just a parallel path to this cannabis reform that we've all been seeking. And people just are not catching on yet. I mean, some are definitely catching on, and it's more every day. So I think that's a big issue. Is just it's just shifting a perspective, and then finally, just like in anything, there are entrenched interests involved here. There are entrenched financial interests, and we can all sort of point to what those are. There's a few of them, but there are people who the way that hemp is coming in is going to disrupt their financial piece, and they're going to resist it. And that's, I mean, I don't like that. It's at least rational, but that's the issue. So that's my view on why we have a lot of pushback from people who are very pro cannabis, supposedly at
Right.
least, right? Pushback against hemp when hemp seems to be really the cleanest and most straightforward path to true cannabis reform right now.
Yeah, one person, I think it was Box Brown that said it. Try to give credit where credit is due. He's a good makes a cannabis comic strip that I might show an example of here in a moment. They said the answer to the cannabis issue is hemp, you know? And I was just
Yeah.
like, just treat it like hemp. I thought that was an
Uh,
interesting way of saying it.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just the sole distinction is the concentration of delta 9 THC, which if you know anything about the plant itself doesn't produce a lot of delta 9 anyway. 0.3% is not a huge barrier. Certainly, all the hemp products, all the cannabis products that you want can be made doing that, including flour.
Yep.
And so it's not a huge barrier. And I see, one possibility through hemp is that we get through another farm bill with the same definition, keep these AGs and all this influence from changing state law, and at the next farm bill, 5, 6 years down the road from there, excuse me, at that point, cannabis is so ubiquitous and normalized in the form of hemp that descheduling marijuana just seems like an after. Sure, of course, we'll have to do that. I mean, that's just that we still have that on. I think it's really hemp is paving this pathway, and I think we just need to get through one more farm bill and prevent some of these states from shutting it down. And I think we'll be in the clear.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to get back to the subject of the financial interests and stuff, but I found the comic strip that I was referring to, and I feel like if you would have showed this to like I always like to use these people as an example, Cheech and Chong, they'd be like, hey, is this good enough for now? Like if you showed them this, be like, look, is this good enough for now? Like you can put this amount of THC in a gummy. Just don't exceed it, and then you can sell these all over the United States. Is that okay? They'd be like, we'll take what we can get. I feel like they would embrace that. It's interesting to think of it that way.
Yep. I completely agree. And a lot of people are beginning to get that. And so I make it a point never to identify the specific financial interests I'm talking about. One is I just don't want to deal with that. I don't,
Sure.
they know who they are. We know who they are. But the other thing is, this perception that I'm talking about is beginning to shift. And some of those larger financial interests behind the scenes are, are pivoting into hemp. Some are doing it openly, some are considering it the back door, some are trying to figure out, oh, wait a second, this is really the opportunity. How do we sort of, I don't know if backpedaling is the right word, but how do we pivot in such a way that we can embrace this without sort of losing this financial piece that we have, or at least, doing it the right way? So I have this, maybe I'm just too much of an optimist, but I have this optimistic view that even some of the financial interests that we have, are kind of wagging our fingers at are actually going to come around and embrace hemp as well. I certainly hope so.
And that's kind of what I was definitely not looking for you to name any names or anything like that, but it is interesting to see, some of the bigger brands, some brands that you can find in dispensaries who typically, and I'm about to display some brands. I'm not saying that the brands I'm about to display have ever talked down about hemp, but typically brands you will find in a dispensary, they will say like, "Oh, this gas station hemp, you don't get the weed at the gas station, you get it at the dispensary." Well, now these are just a few brands I'm displaying on my screen right now that can be found technically both in a dispensary and a gas station. And I think that's okay, actually. One of the things that I showed a listener recently was a video of me walking into a gas station in Southern Illinois, and there were like pre-rolled joints and gummies and vapes next to the boner pills. I'll just kind of be blunt about it. And I was like, weird location, but it's kind of cool that like I could go in, get a Coca-Cola, a candy bar, and a joint. And they were like, yeah, but I don't know that I would trust any of those brands. And I said, okay, hear me out. I get you. I've never seen those brands either. I don't know that I can trust them. But what if it was a brand you could trust? And I'll just insert brand here, right?
Mhm.
What if it was a brand? And then that got their gears turning. They're like, oh, yeah, that wouldn't be that bad. They had to get over the idea of it being like a sketchy option, right? It's like,
Yeah,
okay,
it's
it's a
this
brand.
idea.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought up the convenience store thing because a lot of times people's like, the drop the mic argument they use about hemp is it's sold in convenience stores. Well, let's analyze that. Let's sort of break it down. Convenience stores are highly regulated. They have decades of dealing with regulators and being compliant with selling all sorts of products from alcohol to tobacco to the boner pills you bring up to other substance compounds like kratom and so on and so forth. That, frankly, if there was a group of an established retail sector that would be proper to handle cannabis products, it seems like convenience stores are the right ones. Now, I don't want to annoy my other clients who are other retail sectors. I'm for all sorts of retail segments. I
Yeah.
mean, and I use the example, and I always hate it when people bring up the whole alcohol example, but it just seems the one that's the easiest to go to make comparisons. But like, if I want to go and buy um, you know, a, let's say a beer, or let's say a bottle of wine. That makes it. And there's all sorts of options. I can be part of a wine club where I go online and order it by e-com. I can I can go to a restaurant and get it. I can go to a nice wine shop and look at all the ones and talk to the people. I can go to the grocery store, or I can swing by on my way home and, oh, my wife calls and, hey, can you pick up a bottle of wine? We're going to have some pasta tonight. Boom, I swing by the convenience store and pick up a cheap bottle of wine. There's a place for all of these types of products. And so you go back to the cannabis sector, as long as they're safe, and I want to address that in a minute. You talked about brands and stuff. As long as they're safe, then what's the problem here? And they're adults. We're going to go through. I've got a three-pillared kind of a proposed regulatory approach here, but assuming that they're safe and they're not being sold to minors, then why can't they be sold at convenience stores and grocery stores and health and wellness stores and e-com and so on and so forth? That doesn't make any sense to me that we have to pin them up in this tiny little thing called a dispensary that has all this crazy regulatory burden over it. It doesn't make any sense. And to get to your point about the safety piece, convenience stores, we've kind of got the best of the best and the worst of the worst. We certainly, there's some slummy, unregulated, terrible products that are being sold in some convenience stores, and that needs to change. Absolutely. By the same token, I know personally, because I represent some of them, some of the highest quality hemp products, cannabis products, period, that exist in the world are also sold through convenience stores. And I have personally toured those facilities and gone over all of their SOPs. And so, this idea that they're all terrible is just wrong. It's just wrong.
Yeah. I wanted to give you more space on that. I like that you brought up like it's not that they can't be sold in both stores, and I agree with that. If you're more comfortable going to a dispensary or if it's more convenient for you to go to a retail store. But let's not pretend like cannabis has not been sold for ages without strict regulations. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like,
Right. Yeah,
look,
well,
and
that's a good point.
I'm not saying you can't learn things. I'm not saying we can't get better, but I'm just like, let's start off with the recognition that I remember it used to be a joke that Willie Nelson said the only person he's ever seen got hurt from cannabis was when a bale of it fell on his buddy. So,
That's
you
about
know,
right. Yeah, that's funny. But I mean, truly, no one has ever, this whole thing, no one's ever died. I'm sure there are people out there who are like, oh, but I'll show you this example, and all the examples that people pull, there's always some issue that's possibly some other issue. But the bottom line is, we do need regulated products. I mean, it's a
yeah,
good thing to have have the right amount of regulation. Again, to go back to the wine example, or to use maybe a supplement example. Let's say I wanted to go and get some St. John's wort or some, vitamin C or whatever. I don't want to think about, well, is this product have all sorts of weird contaminants in it? No,
Right.
I don't want to think about that. I can choose the different brands and the dosing amounts and the blah, 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 but I don't want to be worried about that. And so it's really important that cannabis and cannabis products that are sold to the consumers are safe in that respect. And so that's fundamental. And I don't think anyone who's legitimate, doesn't have a concern with that. It's only the people that are the fly by night folks who would oppose that. So.
Right. And like you say, it's, more than, well, it goes hand in hand with what you were just saying. Just to add to, I guess, what you were saying, like it's this idea of, if something did go wrong, we would want to know, like, we would want to know, like, chain of custody, who received these
Sure.
batches so that you could do a
Mhm.
recall like we do with any
Mhm.
other consumable good.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
Yeah.
right.
It's interesting. Well, I know we're bouncing around here, but one of the topics that we've been kind of going around is this idea of intoxication. And I don't know about around the United States, but at least in Illinois, the way the conversation always comes up, it's about they talk about safety a lot. They reference this story with high schoolers who apparently purchased these products in Chicago, and they say that these students were poisoned. Just briefly on intoxication, I don't know the stat right now. I'm looking in 2017. I've got some data of caffeinated energy drink consumption among adolescents
Mhm.
and potential hazards associated with their use. And at least from what I've heard, energy drinks send a lot more kids to the hospital than I mean, at least now compared to these hemp products. And it's just like you say, it starts to seem like it's a coordinated effort, a concerted focus when it's like, well, what really is the issue, right?
Yeah,
So,
I mean, we've dug into that, and no, and we don't want anyone to be hurt. I mean, it's
sure.
not, that's an ideal situation for any product is that no one gets hurt from it, period. But there's all sorts of people getting hurt in way more than with other products, and a lot of normal sort of household type products than with cannabis and hemp products. And to even drill down a little bit further, a lot of times the harm is just that people felt dizzy or their heart was racing or they were anxious and needed to go to the emergency room, and then they just needed to kind of hydrate and chill out for a minute, and then, or not a minute, maybe a couple hours, and then go home. Again, no one wants that kind of outcome, but we're not talking by and large about anything that's sort of life threatening, at least not with respect to the cannabinoid products themselves. Now, if
Right.
there's some contaminated products, that's a different conversation. It's an
Right.
important conversation like we had earlier. And to get to the intoxication thing, the conversation about intoxication needs to change. you know, I think everything is focused on intoxication, and that's problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that it's impossible, certainly from a legal standpoint, to define intoxication. How do we define that? It sounds easy. It's one of those things that everyone can sort of kind of knows what it is, but to define it in a way that helps you to regulate it is it's I call it a fool's errand. It's just not going to happen. It's going to create unintended consequences. The other issue is, we seem to have some sort of a weird fetish and fear as a culture of cannabis intoxication. I mean, the United States and the world is fueled by intoxication. I mean, alcohol, tobacco and nicotine, coffee, you just an array of prescription pills, sugar. I mean, you just go on, kratom and kava, and I mean, the list goes on and on. But for some reason, cannabis, which has been consumed for thousands of years more than any of this stuff, is somehow a terrible form of intoxication. It just blows my mind that that's the case. So it's just this weird cultural piece about it. But I think ultimately, we take that out, and let's get down to the nuts and bolts about this. As long as minors are not allowed to purchase it, and of course minors will always get to it. Minors drink beer, and I mean, I had a fake ID when I was in high school. I mean, but as long as as a system, we are not promoting it, and we have a way to age gate for minors, not to have these products. Secondly, that the products are regulated for safety purposes. Oh, thanks. That's great. So that we have quality control, to go back to my point earlier about if I'm buying St. John's wort or vitamin D or vitamin C or whatever, I don't want to think about, is this safe? We have that. And then third, if we have proper labeling and marketing so that we know what we're ingesting. Hey, guess what? This has X amount of THC in it. You're going to feel high. So you know what to expect. Then why do we care about intoxication? Why don't we let adults make a decision for themselves about what they ingest? And whether we call it hemp, whether we call it marijuana or just cannabis, that to me is the regulatory system that we should push forward. And people will immediately say, oh yeah, but there are the devil's in the details. To be clear, this is an overall sort of an umbrella type of a thing. And on every one of those, reasonable people can disagree. For example, restricting access by minors, to use sort of an easy one. What is that age? Is it 21 or is it 18? As a US culture, we've sort of defined the age of someone being a minor as being younger than 21. I live part-time in Mexico. We travel to Europe a lot. There, it's more of an 18. So, again, reasonable people can disagree about that. But we can all agree that we shouldn't be selling these products to minors, at least not without parental consent. And I think, to even drill down a little bit further, there are going to be some people that push back. Well, what about CBD products? What about? Well, you know what? Again, we can say, well, with parental consent, maybe that's okay. But if your market is underage people, then maybe you've just got the wrong market. I mean, if your bottom line depends on people under the age of 18 buying your products, well, maybe you need to shift the way that you do things. So I don't have a problem with making just a blanket, this is the age of majority. And so we could go through each of these, but every one of these sort of broad pillars has some underlying things. What is GMP for a cannabis product? Are we going to have different categories of cannabis products? Okay, maybe, and I don't want to get, into the weeds about the regulatory piece. What is the labeling, and should that be a national thing or a state thing, blah, blah, blah. But all of those arguments, once we frame it in this way, can be hammered out, and we can figure it out without just going off the rails on this crazy, you know, intoxication ride and trying to figure out how to regulate by intoxication. It's just not going to work.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask, I've heard that there, and feel free to address this. I heard that there might be some valid concerns on like maybe the solvents that people use or the processes in which they create their product. That would be addressed probably by this, right? By
Yeah,
point B.
that's exactly right. I mean, some processes might not be appropriate, but more than that, I think we need to make sure that there's no residual byproducts. Sometimes, Delta 8 is something that most people know nowadays, and I like to use it as an example. I think there's this idea that Delta 8 is somehow dangerous and bad. The Delta 8 molecule itself is not. It's been studied clinically for decades. It's also, from a scientific perspective, it is a stable molecule and a stable compound. But the process of making it, there's different ways to do it, and you can have some additional types of compounds and molecules that are also produced in addition to Delta 8. Some of them may or may not be toxic. How do you remove those so that you have the more purified Delta 8? Additionally, some of the solvents, to your point, a lot of them are acids and things like that. If they're not cleaned up, then they're in there, and that's a toxic piece as well. So that process is really important. And I think you're exactly right. You know, that is one of the things that would be the experts in these types of things would come in and say, this is the proper process to make sure that these products are safe. These are the SOPs that you need to comply with to produce this type of product. Okay, great. I think that's the important piece.
Yeah. Sometimes just kind of on the same vein, sometimes people point out the idea or the use of the word synthesis or synthetic cannabinoids and they get a bad taste in their mouth. And my question is like, what's your take on that, I guess? Like, how do you get somebody to not get so, for lack of better words, worked up about that?
Well, I can use a direct example. So, other than people who are drinking coffee in the morning, but consuming caffeine through energy drinks or sodas or things like that, guess what? You drank synthetic caffeine. You consumed
Mm.
synthetic. And and in fact, I did a little of a dive into this whole caffeine issue. Synthetic caffeine, which is widespread. Most of the people watching this have probably consumed synthetic caffeine in the past week, maybe today, is highly unregulated. The process that's used is highly toxic, and there's not a whole lot of oversight into how it gets made, how it gets into our channels. It's primarily produced in China. China produces good products and it produces terrible products. It's not like I'm not pointing at China, but it's primarily produced outside the US. And that's a synthetic product that we consume regularly. Um, Again, provided that the molecule itself is the same and has the same interactions with our body as the natural product, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the plant itself synthesizes these compounds. The plant starts with CBG and then goes through this cascade of different cannabinoids. That is synthesis. It's just a natural synthesis. So I guess the way I fall on it is I think that we've kind of become um, consumed with this idea that synthetic equals bad. I'm not saying synthetic always equals good. I'm just saying that the fact of something being synthetic does not necessarily mean that it's bad.
Right. And to your point, I just want to make this very clear because it kind of goes back to a point that we made earlier. Some people will say or have the impression that only how am I trying to say this? So the cannabinoid products or the hemp products that you would find in a gas station, they are some people might say they're all synthetic, which we can use an easy example like THCA to prove that that's not correct. But again, to your point of it not being that big of a deal, I have had operators on this show tell me because they're allowed to in multiple states, they use hemp derived cannabinoids in their regulated products
Yeah, I
if
actually
you're
had
following
a
me.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I was on a panel recently, and I was kind of talking about some of the things that we're talking about with the hemp being the path towards reform, and you can have all the same products, but they're hemp and they're federally legal and blah blah blah. And then someone else on the panel, after I finished my piece, said, "Oh, but by the way, we're not making a judgment about this, but you should be aware that the hemp products are synthetic, and if that's important to you." And I was like, "Wait no, 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 no. First of all, not all hemp products are synthetic, and also, and exactly to your point, Cole, some of the products on the regulated, that's in marijuana, some of the marijuana products
Yes.
are also synthetic. So good, bad, or otherwise, it's happening across the cannabis spectrum."
I want to try to refine that just a bit in the, let's say, in the state regulated system. So, for example, in Illinois, if just we've covered this on the show in the past, folks, infused products in Illinois in dispensaries can be infused with hemp derived cannabinoids. So, actually, the first place I ever tried Delta 8, I always like to say this, was in an Illinois dispensary. I didn't.
Yeah.
I heard about it before 2000 and before it would became a big, what it is today. Um, and to just to further underscore our point, I had a testing lab from the state of Illinois on my show, and I said, "Hey, do the companies tell you when they're using hemp-derived cannabinoids?" And he said, "Well, they don't, but like," I said, "But can you tell?" And he said, "No." And
I mean, it's
that's
the same
exactly
molecule, right? The
exactly
only,
that's the point. That's the point I'm
yeah.
trying to make. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there are different, sort of isomers and small deviations that can occur as a result of maybe improper, types of synthesis. Again, the process should be a good one, but right, if we're ultimately talking about the same molecule, it's the same molecule. That's the deal.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm really glad to hear that you're having this array of different folks on your show and that you're, getting this information out because there's just a boatloads and boatloads of misinformation that's out there and misunderstanding about cannabis generally and hemp specifically.
Yeah. And I think a point that I want to make on the show that I think is very important is, for folks that really love the cannabis plant, we should also recognize that what this farm bill has done has basically made seeds legal. They used to
Mhm.
always have to be sold as novelties. And
That's
now,
a that's
yeah,
a really good point. Yeah, I'm fortunate to represent some of the best and biggest seed banks in the world, and the Farm Bill opened that up. And the DEA confirmed it in a letter, and so we're now able to get these seeds out there, and it's fantastic. Again, it's just normalizing a plant that should have never been abnormal in our culture.
yeah. Well, I want to close with speculation if you're all right with that. What do you think the future looks like?
I'll speculate anytime, man. So
Yeah.
yeah, the future is, I think ultimately we are moving towards broad cannabis reform. I feel positive about that, knock on wood. I think what that looks like, we don't know yet. I'm putting out there that hemp is the way and hemp is the path. But I think there's going to be some rocky road to get there. In terms of sort of the near term, I think we're going to continue to see a state by state battleground, where some states will, kind of open up and hemp is really, embraced, and we're going to see the opposite where hemp is, shut off and all sorts of battles. At the farm bill level, I think I'm optimistic that we're just going to see the same thing. In our industry, this is the farm bill and hemp and what's going to happen. But
Right.
stepping back, the farm bill itself is almost 1,000-page document. It dictates agricultural policy for the entire United States for the next 5 years. I mean, there are a lot of heated issues in there, and hemp for Congress is not really one of them. And I'm really thankful for that. And so I think we're unlikely to see any changes. One thing I want to note to the audience that's out there. There has been talk of maybe bumping the THC level to 1%. And the knee jerk reaction for a lot of people is, oh, that's great. That's wonderful. It might not be, and that is it's only wonderful if it's delta 9 THC moving up to
Mm,
1%. Don't just accept that as wonderful, because it may be THC at 1%. Now, there's still a lot of hemp products and in cannabis, in the form of hemp products that can be made with 1%. But it will absolutely cut off some products. And in fact, the most sort of the biggest and most controversial product out there right now is THCA hemp flower, and a 1% THC cap would kill that. So look into this, and don't support things blindly. But anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent. I do feel hopefully optimistic about the next farm bill, but it's going to require the listeners out there to let their lawmakers know that this is important. It's a $28 billion annual sector of the economy, and growing, and it can only continue to grow if our lawmakers, don't step in the way. So let your lawmakers know that this is important to you.
yeah, well said. And to make sure that I'm understanding your point and so that the listeners are too, you're saying, maybe 1% Delta 9 THC would be okay. 1% THC is a little vague, and it could basically leave room to them saying like the decarb formula. Sorry, I'm trying to
Mhm.
be kind of to the point about this.
Yeah. Mhm.
Is that your concern there?
Yeah, I think that if the language is, right now it's no more than 0.3% delta 9 THC. I think if that's changed to no more than 1% THC, I think that, right. I think there's at least an interpretation that that means total THC, the
Right.
post decarboxylation THC.
Gotcha.
So ideally we'd have 1% delta 9 THC. I mean, we would be almost this far from just completely, complete legalization. I mean, that's almost direct legalization level. And I don't anticipate that we're going to get there this year. I think Rand Paul, don't quote me on this, but I think Rand Paul may actually have a bill to raise it to 1% Delta 9. I mean, that would be phenomenal. But again, I'd rather have it stay the same at 0.3% Delta 9 than to get 1% total THC.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess just to put a finer point on speculation, and then I realized I missed a question about local bans that I might just circle around to before we
Sure.
close. Um, to your point, if it feels like there are so many big brands in this, like I guess I'm kind of wondering, do you feel like the cat's out of the bag on this one? Like there's no putting it back in.
I definitely feel like the cat's out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle, and there's some big brands that are out there, and loud and proud, but behind the scenes there are a whole lot more. My office is getting calls. I've talked to colleagues and other folks. There's a huge, you know, shift that's happening, like a major tectonic type of a shift that's happening in the cannabis industry. And I think we're going to see a whole lot more big brands on the market this time next year.
Yeah. And like I said, I wanted to circle back really quick to a local question that I had,
Mhm.
and it's more of a legal one. So I apologize if it puts our listeners to sleep, but I'm just curious if I'm testing kind of my knowledge and just trying to understand honestly if this is how these bans work. I recently had somebody on from Tennessee talking about the Tennessee hemp ban that might go into effect, I guess in June or something like that. Um, and what I didn't realize about, like, I didn't realize it till I got them on air and they told me this. They said, "Oh, the hemp ban only applies to us because we're in Tennessee, but Tennesseans can still buy these products online and have them shipped to Tennessee. There's nothing stopping that." And I guess my question was, I thought I maybe heard that something like that was happening in another state. I don't know if it's Florida. Um, is this their way of getting around the dormant commerce clause is my question, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the best way to answer that is that states are doing all sorts of crazy things. And rather than kind of dialing in on one specific state or
Sure.
putting everyone to sleep with dormant commerce clause, what we see is state officials who are concerned about these so-called, intoxicating cannabinoids from hemp are trying out different ways. And one way is they just ban them outright. Another way is they put, milligram caps, or they don't allow chemically altered or synthetic compounds, or this or this or this. But then what happens sometimes is that states will say, well, you can't you can produce them in the state, but you can't sell them to consumers in the state. Now, you said about Tennessee, it was the opposite. Again, it's sort of an evolving thing, and so that may be the case. It also might be a misstatement of how
Sure.
things are happening too. So I don't want to confirm or deny that.
Sure.
But the bottom line is that one of the problems and the difficulties about the hemp industry is having to navigate all of these crazy rules and regulations that not only differ from state to state, but sometimes are vague and difficult to even comprehend in and of themselves. So I think that's the lesson, is that we have this industry that's robust and growing despite these types of obstacles. If we could remove some of these obstacles and get some more consistency, the industry could just take off.
Yeah. Well, one note I think I wanted to end on that I meant to mention earlier, but I think it's just an interesting note to close on maybe. You mentioned that vested interests probably are a lot maybe they can be pointed to for these crackdowns and such, certainly. The state of Illinois, I think, is a unique case in which our head regulator has actually said, and I'm loosely quoting, that these intoxicating compounds are direct competitors to our social equity licensees. So she added almost added a layer.
Mhm.
So it was not only just a direct competitor to our licensees, but to our social equity licensees,
Yes, right, right.
really playing on the heartstrings.
They are. Well, I mean, I think that shows you how much, how concerned they are about hemp. So, I mean, let's start by saying the war on drugs, and particularly the war on cannabis, has disproportionately affected the people of color and impoverished people and everything else. And we need to rectify that. Social equity is fantastic.
Yeah.
To pull out from that, what we're seeing is a lot of sidestepping social equity. Social equity applicants and license holders maybe sort of being partnered up with big companies. And is that social equity? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. What does social equity mean? Blah, blah, blah. But what I would say is, what is social equity but allowing everyone to compete on a level playing field? And again, hemp allows that. There was a Maryland federal court decision that put a real fine point on this. That Maryland had passed a very draconian, terrible hemp bill that was kind of a giveaway to the license system, and the license system was terrible. And it went into great detail to talk about monopolistic interests and social equity. And so what I like to see is, sure, we can try to dial in the perfect social equity program with these marijuana licenses. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But if we can create a level playing field where it's not a big burden to open up a hemp business, whether you're a grower or a wholesaler or a manufacturer or a dispensary or some combination, a dispensary retailer, um, and then everyone can participate. Well, that's a lot of equity right there, you know. So anyway,
Yeah.
I hope that was responsive to your
No,
question. But
yeah.
I think your point was that this regulator is like, oh, wait a second, you know, we all believe in social equity, which we do, and so now the hemp industry somehow, you know, putting down the social equity piece, and that's just a red herring, and
And
it's
that's why I was kind of surprised to not see them, our state AG, listed on this document you ultimately shared and wrote about. And
mhm.
again, folks, this will be linked in the podcast description because I was in the room when this regulator said, you know, 95, she said 95% of our problems would be solved if this hemp loophole was closed. And she was saying that they were going to speak to the AG to see what can be done. Um, and
What can we
so,
do? Right, right.
right, right. But I was surprised to not see our AG on
That's
this
great.
list. So
Yeah, kudos to the AGs that didn't sign it. You know, I like to think that maybe they thought about it and disagreed. You know, sometimes maybe it didn't get to them in time or they
sure,
were too busy or whatever. And I'm sure
right.
there's some AGs that actually are pro hemp. But I think a lot of it is just knee-jerk reaction. You know, they're misinformed, underinformed, subject to the propaganda that a lot of people are putting out there. But it's just a knee-jerk reaction. Oh my gosh, kids are buying, you know, toxic and intoxicating cannabinoids at grocery stores. We got to put a ban on this. So of course, that sounds terrible. Is that happening? Not to the scale that it's being broadcast as happening, but there are easy fixes. And for anyone who believes in social equity, in cannabis reform, in the rights of people to use products, adults to use products that they believe are right for them, and who believes in small business and the American way, just to put this is all true on it. Hemp is where it's at. You know, that's a fact.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should have also mentioned this earlier. I have what I think is going to be a very unique interview I will be releasing soon with a high schooler that went to a hospital for ingesting hemp compounds.
Wow.
And I will just
Look forward to
tease
seeing
it
that.
by saying that I asked, to your point that you made earlier, and this is what I why I should have brought it up earlier. I asked them, "Do you think you should have gone to the hospital?" And they're like, "Look, I was really high, but I did not want to go to the hospital. The school made me go to the hospital. I just wanted to go home and like eat snacks and like." And I think that's my point. It's like this person was not like, "Oh, I'm dying, I'm dying." You know, were they uncomfortably high? Sure. You
Mhm.
know, and should they have been? No.
Right.
Um, you know, so there are definitely some points in that interview that maybe people that wanted to make an argument against hemp can make. For example, they say that, yeah, they have an easier time of purchasing the hemp products because they do sell them to people under 21, which is
Mhm.
unfortunate to hear. But again, that's
Mhm.
why your proposals are good so that we
Age
can
gating.
prevent
It's
these things.
pretty easy.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Mhm.
And actually, in fact, one of the things they told me was I asked, you know, cannabis is legal here in Illinois. Have you, as you or your friends, are you able to get legal weed? No, that's one of the hardest things to get,
Mhm.
which is
Right.
interesting because when I was a kid, it was one of the easiest things. Not legal weed, but weed. Weed
Right,
was one.
weed,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. My guess is for that student, probably, you know, black market weed is probably pretty easy to get as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, it just all needs to be, you know, cannabis and available to adults, and that's that. So,
Bingo. Well said. Well, hey, Rod, I had a lot of fun going all over the place with you today. Thank you for riding the wave with me.
thank you for, man, Cole. You asked great questions, and you're clearly knowledgeable, and I really appreciate it. It's been nice to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you on again in the future. I doubt this is the last time that hemp's gonna be in the news. I'm sure that it's gonna continue puffing. So
Yep, I think so. Well, listen, thank you again, and I hope you have a great afternoon, and I look forward to talking in the future.
absolutely. Well, folks, I hope you found as much value in this conversation as I did. We'll see you in the next episode of the Cole Memo. Take care, everybody. Bye.